We've already gushed about all of the wonderful tropes that exist in fantasy, the ones I love, the ones I want to keep coming back over and over, give me more. Now it's time to take out the trash. When it comes to my beloved fantasy genre, there are definitely some little cliches, some recurring themes that don't work for me. Of course, this is my opinion. There is no right or wrong when it comes to tropes. You can also take a really great trope that I love and ruin it, and vice versa. You can take one of the tropes from this list and actually make it into a good story. But for the most part, there are just some tropes that don't work for me, and I'm going to tell you exactly why with this list. Feel free to leave in the comments below your least favorite tropes. I would love to know if you agree with me on some of these as well. We're gonna start off with a nice and simple one. One thing I absolutely hate finding in fantasy literature is a clear-cut good versus evil. It's very simple, it's very clear, it's obvious who the bad guys are, who the good guys are, who's supposed to win, who normally does win. It's a very black and white portrayal of what is good and what is bad. This, just put quite simply, does not exist in real life. It doesn't exist. There are some things, of course, in real life that are very clearly a good thing and very clearly a bad thing, but there's a lot of gray. There's a lot of morally gray people. There's a lot of situations where there's not a clean-cut, good way, right way to do something. There's just a lot of gray in the world we live in. So I guess, why some people like this clear-cut theme in fantasy, because you're escaping from the horrid gray of the world, because that can make things very complicated, but I just don't like it. I get so bored when a story is this simple. Of course, there are exceptions, you know, for example, Lord of the Rings, a lot of people have criticized of having a very kind of clean-cut good versus bad, and that is true in some aspects, but it's not completely true in other aspects as well. There's also the fact that Lord of the Rings was meant to replicate a certain style of mythology and old texts that did kind of have this theme and this way of creating a story, and that's not what I look for in the majority of cases when I pick up a fantasy novel. I'm not looking for something that is trying to replicate to that extent sort of the mythology themes. I'm looking for a good, compelling story. In fact, I have kind of a soft spot for morally gray characters and people who are not evil but aren't necessarily great either, and that just doesn't work within a realm when it's very obvious what's right and what's wrong. You can't have morally gray in your color palette. Another recurring, what I consider to be a flaw in fantasy, especially young adult fantasy, although that might just be because I read more young adult fantasy than adult fantasy, is this idea of this normal person who at the beginning of the story, there's nothing special about them, and then you flip a page and all of a sudden they're a badass warrior and they're, you know, winning battles and they know how to do all these like super advanced skillful things. Just like you blink and all of a sudden your normal person is literally winning battles with like soldiers who have trained their entire life, or able to compete with someone who at the beginning of the story was introduced as this like really impossible to beat, you know, bad guy, and then all of a sudden they're able to kick their ass, even though that, you know, yesterday they were barely able to tie their shoes. This is so common, and I feel like a lot of this is just a pacing issue, because if you gave us more time to be realistically convinced that this person could learn all these new skills and become this, you know, badass warrior, if you gave us more time for that, it would be believable. But there's also just an element of unbelievability in general, of the idea that someone who often starts as not necessarily a shell, they can have like characterization, but they start, you know, being unable to do very much of anything when it comes to, I don't know, fighting battles or even, you know, political, like sitting on a throne, you know, being a leader. It's one thing for the character to assume this new role over the course of the story, to learn new skills and to, you know, develop. That's what we want out of a character. But often in stories, it's just taken to an extreme that then becomes contrived and unbelievable. Like someone who can barely stand up in front of a crowd and speak, all of a sudden at the end of the book, they're like the most convincing leader that has ever led, and they have all these skills that just make no sense with the person we were introduced to at the beginning. I don't care what kind of a magic background you give this character, or you give me the story that they have a natural like knack for it or something. It's just not believable if you take it to too far of an extreme, and so often it's taken to too far an extreme. Let's talk about those really evil characters that somehow end up being our love interest at one point in the story. When I was talking about fantasy tropes I put enemy to ally, which also can include enemy to lover. I put that on one of my favorite tropes because I absolutely love when there's friction and then it becomes something else. That's just fantastic. But what I don't love is when you have a character that is just by definition evil, and you don't even have to have a black and white good and evil system in order to have an evil character. You can have someone who's just done some very unforgivable things. Murdering lots of people, having some really, really wicked opinions and voicing them in a way that's just completely unforgivable, that can't be turned back from. And so often this line is sort of blurred, or I guess looked over, in the sake of an interesting love twist, I guess. But so often not so often, okay, I won't say that, but it's too often that I've read a story that has an evil, evil person, someone who I can never forgive, readers can never forgive, and yet at one point in the story, we're expected to believe that they can be fallen in love with, and your often protagonist falls in love with this objectively evil person, this person who's not a good person. And it's one thing to redeem a character in some way. Even a character that's unredeemable, I guess, you can win back a certain element, like a certain amount of that. But there's just a line that's crossed when it comes to actually making them a love interest. Getting characters together, forming a romance that I'm supposed to actually care about when I cannot stand one of the characters because they have done things that cannot ever be backed up from. You know, you can't ever take those things back. You can't ever make me like them or make me forgive them for those things. So I can't do that. How about one of the oldest ones in the fantasy playbook, the mentor who dies? This one's actually kind of poetic in some ways, so I will admit it can, I guess, be done well, but I am getting really tired. I think it's just that for this one, getting tired and sick of seeing this in books. But when you introduce a mentor, it's usually a person that the protagonist is meeting for the first time in the story as well. It's usually not someone they knew before. They get a new mentor who's able to help them on their journey, or who's able to help them assume the role they need to assume. Whatever it may be, you got your Ben Kenobi who's introduced into the story, and conveniently then, as soon as your characters learned enough from them that they can now do some cool thing in order to progress the plot, that mentor just conveniently dies. Could be sickness, could be getting murdered in order to give our protagonist a bit more like inspiration to then complete his quest and avenge his mentor. Whatever the reason is, the mentor very conveniently dies when he's of no more use to your main character, or normally like right before he's of his full use to the main character, so that they still have something to overcome. But still, it's after he's shared what he needs to share, the main character has grown as much as he needs to grow for that point in the plot, and then dead. It's just too contrived. It's too predictable, I think. Very, very often when a mentor is introduced, I get it in the back of my head like, wonder how long this one's gonna last, because 9 times out of 10, he's gonna die at one point. I understand why people do it. I really understand, because it does help your character, you know, go from point A to point B, or from point B to point C, and then once they're no longer useful, it's an easy way to get them out where your character can then have to, you know, fight their battles by themselves without their mentor's help. I get why it's used, but it's just very contrived. Everyone gets why it's used, and therefore it's just not fun anymore. Something else that has definitely been exhausted in the fantasy genre is overly described worlds. I am looking at you, Tolkien, I'm sorry. And it's not just him, it is so many that followed him, because actually he was at least somewhat original, because fantasy was still kind of a developing genre at the time. But now a lot of people have picked up on this trend, and it's just become kind of one of those, not staples of fantasy, but it really is a trope. It's just a trope. It's what a lot of people criticize fantasy for, honestly, and don't like about fantasy. And of course it doesn't exist in all fantasy, thankfully, because it's just kind of tired. Even if you've created a really great world like Tolkien did, even if you have so much potential to write encyclopedias about the different places and peoples and things in your world, please don't give them to me in word dumps on every page. It's fantastic, actually, if you have a world that has potential to be, you know, dumped upon your readers. It's great that there are that many details in your story, and I would love to know a lot of them throughout the story, but it's just the way of incorporating it. And often fantasy writers, I guess because the worlds often are so different and so well developed in fantasy, we want to share them. We want everyone to know all these cool things that we've invented, but at the end of the day, readers just don't care that much. They don't want to know all those details, or if they learn those details, it's much better to integrate them a little bit more seamlessly into the story, to where instead of, you know, pages upon pages of explaining how the world works, you show it by maybe introducing a character from a different realm or something, so that you're able to show the readers what people from this realm are like, instead of telling them and just explaining it in a big dump, or describing so excessively a world that the reader can't possibly paint the picture because they fell asleep like 2 pages ago. While we're on the subject of world building, let's go on to cheesy dialogue in the guise of world building. This is something that I feel like is actually becoming more common, or at least I'm finding it more in literature, when you have these moments of dialogue, and sometimes this, dialogue can already be a little bit contrived depending on how you're writing it. It is something you have to be careful with because you can even be contrived in characterization through dialogue. But then sometimes writers will throw in these little elements of world building, like they'll make up, I don't know, swear words in a certain language, or they'll throw in these little references to things. And sometimes it works, and sometimes it's just super cheesy. And I'm finding a lot of instances of cheesy dialogue when it's just too much. Like, isn't it convenient that the characters speak like your native language? In my case, I'm reading a book in English, so everyone speaks English, everything's in English. Their lexicology, the way they speak English, is usually very common to the way we speak English right now in the year, 2020 or 2015 or whenever the book was written. But it's very modern, everything is very natural, and then all of a sudden it's the swear word that is like this weird wonky thing. That's it. The rest is just normal, regular, everyday English. I do like it if you can incorporate some interesting elements in the dialogue, some new words, some different phrases. And of course, I understand that the majority of the writing has to resemble our modern day language, otherwise we wouldn't understand it, and we have to be able to access those characters and to connect with them. But I like it when I can understand it. If you have a deity in this world and therefore they, swear in a certain way, or just express themselves in a certain way based on this, based on the religion, based on the leadership, based on the politics, based on something, like give me a reason why, then it's more convincing, then it's less contrived, and it's a lot less cheesy. A trope that is definitely not unique to fantasy, but that I find quite often in fantasy, is a contrived romance subplot. Of course, it exists in tons of different genres. You can actually incorporate it in pretty much every genre except romance. But I find it's very common in fantasy because a lot of fantasy is focused on, a quest or a journey, or, even something a little bit less stereotypical than a quest or a journey, but usually there's still a lot of elements of plot that are propelling your story forward. So romance often is really just a good subplot, and it's very common to find a romance subplot. And often, I think maybe because it is so common, you find contrived ones. Probably because the author thought, I have to have somebody get together in this story, so I'm gonna force these two people together, even though there's no reason why they should like each other, and there's no compelling reason for the readers to like either one of them or them together, or to get invested in it. That's a problem. That really does not work for me. And I love a good romance subplot, but you have to convince me. You have to take the time out of your main plot and your main character development to convince me why I want to care about these two people getting together. Lastly, a trope that is very common to fantasy that can be done really well, but most of the time is not done very well, is the trope of having one magical object of some sort that holds all the keys, that holds all the power, and that is in some way integral to the plot and to the story. Let's just put Tolkien aside because he breaks so many rules and does so many things in different ways and was published a long time ago, so it's a completely different scale. What I'm talking about is in books that I pick up now that are being published today, and when it comes to the kind of all-powerful magical object, it's fun in sort of older mythological classic literature. But let's maybe find a new trope in 2020. It is technically possible to take this trope and to make it into something interesting and fun and unique, but for the most part, all of the angles that are interesting, fun, and unique have been done before, and there's just something very old about this trope. If you read something that was written 100 or more years ago with this trope, it's different. You read it with a different perspective. But when I read a new piece of literature who uses this trope, it tends to just feel vintage in a way that does not complement the story. Alright, now that I have sufficiently offended probably every single one of you by putting maybe one of your favorite tropes on my least favorite list, I'm just gonna wrap up there. Let me know in the comments what are some of your least favorite tropes. You don't have to agree with me on them. You can add more to the list. You can also defend some of these tropes. Go for it. This is all just an opinion, really, at the end of the day. If you haven't already done so, make sure you check out my favorite fantasy tropes video. It is linked in the description box below if you would rather hear me gush than complain, because I talked about all of my absolute favorite ones, the ones that resonate with me the best, the ones that I just cannot get enough of. And of course, if you want to see more videos like this in the future, sort of best and worst, favorite and least favorite in fantasy or in any other type of genre, let me know in the comments or send me a tweet or send me a message on Instagram and let me know the topic that you would like me to do next. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will talk to you very soon in another video.